Hello and welcome to the Cultural Stew podcast. This is the next episode of Mini Moments of Influence. Today I am excited to welcome my next guest, Dan Lopata.
Hi.
Dan, tell me a little bit about yourself.
I would like to qualify myself almost as a musician. I do play a lot of music live. I met Ron through running. And as far as music is concerned, I play any style except for, I should stop saying except for pop country. For whatever reason, it just doesn't work for me. But I do everything from classical to blues, and I make a lot of money doing the blues, but have always been into the punk scene since as far back as I can remember.
And the punk scene brings us right into what Dan has decided to talk with me today about, and that is the Clash's London's Calling album. A little background on the Clash. They formed in 1976.
They formed in 76. They were supposed to be the next big thing, but the record companies didn't really want to take a risk on them. They released their first album. It was in Britain only, and it became a really sought-after import in the U.S. It was a fantastic album. Never really sold much. Then they signed with CBS and released Give 'Em Enough Rope, which was kind of a flop. Great tunes on that as well. And basically it was just four guys that wanted to make a statement and, following the Sex Pistols and all that, but a little bit more. So the third album out of the gate was London Calling, and they decided to go basically no holds barred with it and escape all of the punk aesthetic, if you would. At that time in 1979, people would sit there and go, you can't play reggae, that's not punk, or you can't get into soul and rhythm and blues, that's not punk. And they said, screw it, this is what we're going to do. And they got into a recording studio and really didn't have any material and started practicing and started playing old tunes and that they all grew up with, which were rhythm and blues and reggae and whatnot, and then started writing and came up with a double album worth of material and decided that they were going to cut a double album, but on their own terms, they were going to sell it for the price of a single album.
That's pretty impressive. And before we dig into London's album, so it came over into the United States in 1980, a little bit later than because of the UK release. And in 2004, Rolling Stone actually ranked the Clash as the number 28 of all time, but they ranked this album as 8th out of 500. And the song London's Calling 15 out of 500. And if you're unfamiliar with the Clash, almost everybody has probably heard the song, Will They Come, what is it?
Rock the Casbah, Should I Stay or Should I Go?
Should I Stay or Should I Go, which has been used in tons of media in the last little while. So their punk style is very predominant in music today. As I went through and listened to this album, I don't know how I've never listened to this album before. But I love alternative rock. The White Stripes are one of my biggest things. But as I listen to it, I'm like, oh, there's Green Day. Oh, there's White Stripes. Oh, there's a little bit of U2. Oh, there's a little bit of REM. Heck, there's Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire. All these little things that have come from the Clash, But
there's Brian Setzer.
There's Brian Setzer. I was just saying to somebody the other day, one of the songs on there reminded me straight from one of the Dropkick Murphys songs. I'm like, holy cow, this is just everywhere. I mean, rockabilly, ska, the whole movement. I mean, I was a 90s kid, so I came into the alternative, and I loved rockabilly. I loved the new swing scene, which all these guys were ska guys that got all of that.
Yep. Well, they called themselves the only band that mattered. Seriously, that was what they called themselves, and And you can hear it. You can hear it through pretty much everything that came after them. It's funny that you mentioned Should I Stay or Should I Go and that, because that album was the reason why Joe Strummer actually ended up firing Mick Jones, because it became too commercial. So you've got that punk strain, and Joe's going, "This is too much. This is too clean, man. We can't do this anymore." But yeah, you can hear it. You can hear it all over.
So digging into London's Calling. So you grew up. When did you first start getting into music?
As young as I can remember. I grew up in a household that was more about, Arlo Guthrie, the 1960s, and folk music. And then I was the youngest of 4 kids. And so my brothers and sisters were huge Who fans. And then the Who broke up, and my sister was looking for, and I can only listen to so much Who without, reliving my past, so I don't anymore. But then my sister was looking for a new band, and she discovered The Clash, and it caught my ear, and I was like, oh, this is neat, and went from there. But up until that point, I was listening to primarily, I want to say, progressive rock like Rush and Genesis and even Kiss. I wasn't so much into punk at that time, and with the introduction of London Calling, which really, I don't want to call it a punk album because it really escapes the whole 1, 2 chord, 3 chord punk aesthetic, and it expands itself. It really caught my ear and caught my attention and introduced me to reggae music beyond Eric Clapton's I Shot the Sheriff, which I believe Rolling Stone ranked as one of the worst cover songs of all time.
So walk me through London's Calling. You first crossed paths with it, when?
London Calling, I want to say it was probably around 84, around that time that The Clash, Combat Rock came out in 84, so everybody was listening to it then. But it was right before Combat Rock that I started listening to them. And in London Calling, there were a whole bunch of different songs that had different feels. There's actually only one cover on there, and it's a 1959 tune, and that's Brand New Cadillac. So you had this rhythm and blues thing happening, but it was hard driving. And then you had Wrong 'Em Boyo, which was this hard driving ska thing, and it was just like all of these different sounds coming at me, and in a horn section, and I was a trombone player at the time. It was like, oh, cool, there's brass happening here and everything else. But the thing that really caught me, because of course I was a jaded youth, was there was one line in a song, Death or Glory, that explicit warning, the line is, I believe in this, and it's been tested by research, that he who fucks nuns will later join the church. And I'm sitting there going, oh my God, they swore. And they don't really swear on any of their tunes. And it seemed like it was such a funny line, and such an edgy line that I could grip into it, and nobody else my age was into that type of stuff. So, it was a way for me to, be in my own niche in crowd with only a few other people that knew what was going on, because that's always been kind of my personality. So yeah, I could walk you through the album. But we don't have that much time. There's just tons of stuff on there, and what happened was, through listening to it, I started digging into the lyrics, and I never listened to lyrics. I am all about tone and harmony and things like that. But this album was different, and partly because of that line. And when I started discovering what they were really talking about, the line before that is, in every gimmick, hungry yob, digging gold from rock and roll, grabs the mic to tell us he'll die before he's sold. But I believe in this, and it's been tested by research, that he who fucks nuns will later join the church. And what he's talking about is, there's all these people out there saying, I'm a rock and roll star. I'm going to make it. I'm going to make it, and I'm not going to sell out. And then that line about nuns is, yeah, you're playing with the music industry. Eventually, you're going to join. And I was like, wow. Revelation. These guys are talking about what it's like to be working in this stuff, what it's like to be in the world. And then all the political upheaval that was happening. You can hear in other tunes references to Ronald Reagan. They never mention him by name. They talk about fascism a lot and about what was happening in the world today and how it was echoing the 30s. Spanish Bombs is about the Basque bombings that were happening in the 70s, and at the same time it was about the Spanish Revolution that resulted in General Franco becoming a dictator. And they were talking about all these political and social upheaval issues that were resonating during the time, and I was just becoming aware of them as an adolescent, that, you know, there was more to the world than just, you know, me and a cigarette and a bottle of booze. And it really opened my eyes to music, what it could do, what it could say, and opened my eyes as to what was happening in the world and how it's all happened before, and it keeps cycling around and around and around. And it really shaped a lot of political opinions for me. They are unabashedly socialist. You could call me a socialist. Partly because of them.
Right. So I don't want to date you with how old you are, but I mean, most men don't care about telling their age. So what age were you when you hit this?
I'm looking at 13, 14 years old. I had just basically, I remember 7th grade, I was listening to The Clash. By the time I was in 9th grade, I went to Spry Junior High in Webster, and we had a 9th grade lounge.
Another thing we have in common.
We had a 9th grade lounge where there was foosball tables and pool tables, and we had a stereo, and the incoming 9th graders could paint the walls. And I remember that my friend Angie DiMaria, she was a huge Loverboy fan, which I found hilarious. I didn't get down to paint the walls, but she painted an original Clash logo from their first album on the wall because of me, because she knew I was such a fan. And it was just one of those things where it was like, that was my thing. I was clearly an adolescent. I was beginning to, you know, dabble in chemicals and things like that. But I was also trying to find my voice. I was trying to find who I was, and they just resonated with me. And I started walking around with a long trench coat and bleached up hat, and I had a leather jacket underneath, and I just, started becoming an outsider. I should mention, growing up in elementary school, I was bullied quite a bit, and so it was like one of these things where I was starting to stand up and fight back, I think, just with my image. It was like, okay, if you're going to, single me out and make me an outsider, I'm going to embrace this and make myself an outsider, and this is how I'm going to hang on to it, by falling into this scene and dealing and listening to this type of music.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the powerful things of music, that it doesn't happen in really any other medium, is that music can really define who we are on a daily level. Especially through high school. I mean, it affected me in the way I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was a big swing kid and ska kid as I got into alternative. So as I started getting into my high school year, everybody knew me as the swing kid, and I got to perform a swing dance with the high school band because that everybody knew me with that.
Yeah, we got to get you out to swing dances. I play swing dances. We need to see you, Ron.
It's been a while. But the way that music takes a hold of us and really can define who we are in that way that, you mentioned, in the way that you dressed, and you started setting yourself apart from other group. I think it has a very defining, almost like an axe splitting moment of being able to, are we going to be one of the herd, or are we going to be one of those ones that can define and feel our voice going forward?
Right.
And I think with what the Clash put out, and I think what broke off from them, the bands that came from them, define that style of stop following the norm, do what is central to your core, and go forward and be true to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could see that a lot in high school. I mean, it was music that people would identify with. We had the jocks, we had the dopers, and we had the art kids. And the art kids were into the Clash, and they were into prog rock. The dopers were into Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, and I dug them as well too. So it was like I was kind of lost in the mix of all of it, but you could see it all, and you could see through the style of dress, you could see through what they were listening to, and that's and that's I agree. Music was one of the ways for adolescents to find where they fit, and I think the Clash was really powerful with that. I can move beyond that too, as far as how they influenced me musically too, because especially with this album, you talk about the swing, you talk about the ska, and they did that. Another interesting fact that I picked up, the album cover, London Calling, is the same font and the same color scheme as the original Elvis Presley album cover.
Is it pink and blue?
It's the pink and green.
Okay, pink and green with the...
And it had Elvis with his guitar up, and with the Clash London Calling,
smashing a guitar.
It's Paul Simonon smashing his bass at Hammersmith Palais. And what that was to signify was Elvis was the birth of rock and roll. We're the death of rock and roll. And if you listen to the album and you hear the rock and roll and you hear the ska and you hear the throwbacks, it's the type of thing that pushes back, and they weren't really trying to denigrate the older music. They were actually celebrating it. So if you listen to something like Jimmy Jazz, it's got this laid-back 1-4-5 jazz feel. If you listen to Brand New Cadillac, that's in a 1959 cover tune. And actually, I've always wanted to cover The Clash, and I never have. The closest I've come is playing Brand New Cadillac, but that's not their tune. You listen to the ska stuff, they threw back and they were embracing this music, which really, as I go through life, I listen to the music that I started playing, and primarily, I'm playing 1940s, 1950s music a lot of times with bands like the White Hots and whatnot, and I can relate it to the Clash. These were the things that they were listening to, and they were revering it, and they were modernizing it, and they were bringing it to the modern age. And I hope that I'm kind of doing the same thing. So this album particularly has stuck with me, from an emotional, a political, and a musical aspect. And it has grown and evolved through time. And then my understanding of it has grown, or my interpretation of it, because I don't know if you ever really understand what was behind what they wanted. It's all about how you receive it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That's a good point to remember. I mean, music is always what you can bring to it. I mean, you can have the crappiest song in the world, but if it means something to you personally, then it could be the best song in the world.
We call those guilty pleasures.
I think London's Calling is a good guilty pleasure, though, because aside from it having something, it says something meaningful into what they're presenting. They have a lot of those leftist ideals, and we are living in a very politically charged time right now.
If you listen to the album today, I mean, think about it. The album was basically written when Margaret Thatcher got into office and Reagan was just about to get into office in 1980. And they knew this and they saw this. And all of the content, it's not explicitly talking about them, but it is talking about them. And if you listen to that album and you listen to it today, and you listen to how they're talking about how corporations are taking over. Clampdown is one of the greatest songs on that album. It talks about, selling your soul to the man. It talks about taking the best of your years of your life and working for some corporation and whatnot that's just going to beat you down, and you're sitting there and you're just trying to make money. And what's it all for? And it translates to today. It translates to what we see in office today, what we see in society today. And the question is, okay, are you going to go that route or aren't you? And if you're not, what are you going to do? Are you just going to sit and observe, or are you going to take action? And that's what the Guns of Brixton is all about, which is, I believe, the only song that the lyrics weren't written by Joe Strummer. They were written by Paul Simonon, who's the bass player, and he wrote it, and he actually sang that tune. It's the only tune that he sings on the album. And it's all about, fascism, it's the whole, they came for this group, and I didn't say anything. And then they came for this group, and I didn't say anything. And then when they came for me, there was nobody to step up. And so the Guns of Brixton is when they kick at your front door, how you going to go? Shot down on the pavement or waiting on death row? You know, it's like, what are you going to do? You going to stand up or are you going to fall down? Sorry.
No.
Aside.
No, it's exactly what I'm going for here. So I know you'd recommend the whole album, but if you were to pick out one song for somebody that just walked up to you and said, I needed to listen to one song from The Clash today, which one would you pick out?
One song from this album or one
song from this album?
Clash? Okay. Because I want people to be able to, I think the most approachable song that has so many layers to it and is actually a love song that people don't realize is a love song is Lost in a Supermarket. It was written by Joe Strummer and it was sung by Mick. And it's a really nice song, and most people know it. It was actually in one of those animated movies, and Ben Folds covered it. But it's about Mick's upbringing. He came from a broken family and lived with his uncle, and basically was an abused child and didn't know where he was going with his life and everything else. And this was Joe's way of saying, dude, I saw what happened with you and I'm empathizing with you. And this song is about you and you've made it. And it's a really, really beautiful song, but it also talks about all the despair that was in his upbringing, and whether or not you've had those specific things happen, everybody's got something in them that has left a mark that hasn't been great, and it and so there's that emotional relationship that you can have with that song. To follow up, and I'm going to cheat because there's a second song that follows up that, and that's I'm Not Down, which talks about the same stuff, but then it talks about how you break out of it. And there's a lot of layers to that song that I relate to as well. That's probably my favorite song on the album. But if I were to recommend one to anybody to get involved in The Clash and London Calling, it would be Lost in a Supermarket, which most people know that tune.
Well, Dan, I thank you very much. I thank you for bringing in London's Calling and The Clash and getting me back into listening to some of the music that I just haven't heard before, and respecting who they are and what they did going forward for all the stuff I listen to currently. Dan, where can we find you on social media if you want to be found? When you want to be found?
Dan Lopata Music on Facebook usually is a good place to find where I'm playing and what groups I'm playing with. You can find me playing with the White Hots. Typically, we're once a month at the Little Theater. You can see me play with Genesee Johnny, which is a blues act. You can see me play with the Juke Kings, which is another blues act, and Crab Apples, which is a 3-piece pop ensemble, and it's all original music, and it sounds a bit like Britpop, so think things like XTC. And they're a really fun band that, we've played twice in 2 years. So if we get out, you got to go see us because you never know if you're ever going to see us again.
Before we wrap up, you had mentioned earlier that you were a trombone player, but what is your preferred instrument of choice?
I was a trombone player, became a bass trombone major at Ithaca College, then dropped out of school, and then yada, 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 and picked up electric bass and played that for a long time, and then got a degree in string bass, and string bass is actually my instrument du jour right now, and I work with it in all the bands that I mentioned, except for Crab Apples, where I'm playing electric bass, which is fun, but I just can't take it's funny, we're talking about punk music, and I just can't take playing loud anymore. I'm old, man. I'm old.
And as always, you can find me pretty much everywhere as at GF Media or GF Media CEO. You can find us at culturalstew.net or at culturalstewnet on Twitter and Cultural Stew on Facebook.
It's vegan stew.
It's vegan stew. Thank you, Dan. Liked what you've heard, please consider sponsoring us on Patreon. Patreon is a creator support system that allows people to support the things they love and creators to continue doing what they love. Head on over to patreon.com/gfmedia and choose the Cultural Stew podcast levels to show your support for us. Thank you.